Good afternoon and welcome to today's energy seminar. We have a really special speaker today and one of the more timely seminars in recent memory. But first, to introduce our speaker today and moderate, I'd like to introduce our good friend and colleague, Holmes Summel, who, as many of you know, is the resident fellow at the Explore Energy House and the Precourt Institute managing director of the Energy Equity and Sustainable Transitions Program. And Holmes not only figured out that our speaker was going to be in town today, way before anybody else, recruited her to speak, and now has helped organize this session with Christina. So, Holmes, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here. Today, Stanford has hosted an energy and electricity roundtable pulling 70 people from around the country to focus attention on energy transitions in our time. Christina Costa is one of the 70 participants of that roundtable. We're so fortunate that she's a part of the Stanford Energy Seminar today. I also want to acknowledge that this seminar series has hosted in its past members of the Biden administration who are a part of this story, the 28 months later, lessons from the Inflation Reduction Act. And I want to name them because some of you have been following this series or watching online for a few years. Ali Zaidi was here from his perch in the White House. David Crane came to campus, talked all about the Office of Clean Energy Deployments out of the Office of the Department of Energy, where you had something like $62 billion worth of projects to manifest. We also heard from Luke Bassett as he was describing the project of moving guidance for all of the tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act through the process of finally making them real in the U.S. economy. And today we are going to hear from Christina Costa, who all the while, when every one of those visitors was here, Christina Costa was working in Washington, D.C. in multiple dimensions of interagency and intergovernmental coordination to produce the results that the policy promised. I want to offer a dignified introduction formally to give you some sense of recognition of Christina's background. Up until Inauguration Day, just 3 weeks ago, Christina served as the Deputy Assistant to the President, and Director of the Office of Clean Energy Innovation and Implementation in the Biden White House. There, she was responsible for managing the successful implementation of clean energy and climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And Christina Costa managed that lean White House team and its interagency process to see the guidance through for those clean energy tax provisions that we discussed right here in this very seminar with Luke Bassett last spring. In addition, Christina Costa made sure that high percentage of the total amount of grants that were available under this policy were committed and obligated by the end of the Biden administration, $98 billion in total. And of course, that money was leveraged by almost 4 times as much from the private sector, more than $450 billion being mobilized for those investments. Prior to her White House role, Christina Costa was senior advisor and speechwriter for Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. She also served in the Obama White House in an earlier stint and participated in the 2016 campaign to elect Hillary Clinton to president. And in the United States Senate, Christina Costa first cut her teeth in legislative affairs and worked in the interim at the Center for American Progress with John Podesta, who was also an instrumental part of the Inflation Reduction Act, for those of you that follow the policy. I would like you to warmly welcome Christina, who's joined us here from Washington, D.C., to give us a first-person perspective on what it takes to implement the largest clean energy and climate investment bill in the history of the United States, what it means 3 weeks later to see that policy in the headlines in multiple media cycles. We're going to hear from Christina with some prepared remarks and then shift to a fireside chat. That means I'm putting you all on notice to stay close with where Christina is leading the conversation and be ready to jump in when we turn to your questions. With no further ado, please welcome Christina Costa.
Well, thank you, Holmes, for that incredibly warm introduction, and thanks, John, and thanks, Rachel, and to the Stanford community for welcoming me here today. It's an incredible pleasure to be here with you all. I titled this 28 months later, not just because it's been approximately 28 months since the Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act in August of 2022, which in the realm of energy policy and federal policy making generally is just a blink of an eye. But also because getting everything done that we got done in that 2.5 year span was not unlike running away from the fast zombies in the 28 Days Later franchise. They were rising up everywhere all at once. And so I thought it was an apt metaphor for this moment in time. Let's start with the basics. What is the Inflation Reduction Act? As I said, passed in August of 2022. In comparison to a lot of approaches to climate policy, you can think of the IRA as being almost all carrots, basically no sticks. Instead of mandating certain technologies or issuing a bunch of regulations to stop doing certain things, it was a lot of incentives to the public and the private sector in the form of grants, loans, and tax incentives to try to lower the costs of clean energy technologies, to invest in places that have been left behind by the energy transition, by other economic transitions over recent decades, to reinvest in U.S. manufacturing, and also fundamentally in doing all of these things in the clean energy sector to try to diversify supply chains for the United States electricity system and transportation system in particular, away from a growing dependence on sources located in the PRC. The United States had an advantage in solar panel manufacturing, for instance, in the early part of the century that then was entirely ceded to the PRC, and there was an entire industry that needed to be rebuilt more or less from the ground up. And the Inflation Reduction Act was aiming to do that. This is a lovely pie chart from the EPA, not known for its graphic design skills, and I am not known for my graphic design skills either, so I shouldn't throw shade at the EPA. But the reason that's there is to just refresh in everybody's memory how emissions break down by sector, and to illustrate how the different pieces of the IRA really map onto this giant pie of a problem. And so in dealing with the largest source of emissions in the United States today, the transportation sector, you see this mix contained in the Inflation Reduction Act of tax incentives to lower the cost of procuring electric vehicles, to lower the cost of installing EV charging infrastructure, tax credits to the private sector to invest in the battery supply chain here in the United States. And as we'll see, that has gone absolutely gangbusters since the IRA passed, as well as direct investments from the federal government to the private sector to help invest in manufacturing EVs, to help invest in producing lower carbon biofuels and sustainable aviation fuel. And you can do that all the way around the pie chart. And so this is a really, really, really big law with a lot in it, and a lot of work for the federal government to do over the course of those 2.5 years. What did we get done to do all of that? Well, as Holmes noted, out of the grant funding coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, we awarded nearly 90% of the funds to non-governmental, to non-federal entities. So those are grants going to states, to cities, to tribes, to private organizations, to non-governmental organizations, to invest in clean energy, to invest in climate smart agriculture, to do all of the things on the previous chart. We obligated $98 billion of those dollars. And this is an important distinction that we're going to talk about with where the Inflation Reduction Act is now following the change in administration. And so the way that the federal government spends grant money is that it selects folks to receive the awards on a competitive basis. People file applications with departments and agencies to compete for the funding. And then the departments and agencies go through a process to select winners. It is a process where they score those applications based on a rubric that is set out at the outset. So everybody kind of has a sense of how competitive are they going to be in the process. It is run by career civil servants. There is not a political valence in that selection process, or at least there was not when we were there. And then those awards get announced. But it's not where it ends, because then the selectee for the award enters into a contract negotiation with the federal government to agree to how they are going to spend the money, to agree to how they are going to meet certain milestones to achieve the goals of the program, to how they're going to be judged against the spending of the funds, and to provide ongoing oversight, because these are taxpayer dollars. This is a public responsibility, and you need to make sure that the funding is being spent as intended and as the grantee promised to do so. Once that contract negotiation is complete, the government signs, the counterparty signs, and the funding it becomes what is known as obligated, and it means that it is subject to this binding contract between the government and the counterparty, and subject to all the kinds of contract law that underpin the operations of the economy between private and private entities, as well as between private and public entities. And so that $98 billion is supposed to be spent according to the terms of those contracts, unless one of the parties violates their contract terms. And this is, as we'll talk about, one of the things that has been thrown into a lot of uncertainty by the actions of the new administration. But we continue. Of the funding that is unobligated, that we sort of did not get to, you might look at this pie chart and say, Christina, you only got, 3/4 of the way through the pie. What's the deal? Wasn't the pie delicious? That yellow wedge there, the $15.5 billion approximately, was funding that Congress told us at the outset we could not spend until fiscal year 2025 or later. So fiscal year 2025, for those who are not just deep in the weeds of federal budgeting, didn't begin until September of 2024. And so we really did not have time for the fiscal year 2025 money to flow, and certainly did not have time for funds that were earmarked for later in the calendars to go either. So that was money that legally we could not touch. And so we did, I think, a reasonably good job of getting money out the door in a responsible and legally binding way. In addition to those grants, not shown on this pie chart, our colleagues at the Loan Programs Office, which received substantial additional funding and loan authority through the Inflation Reduction Act, reached financial close on nearly $60 billion worth of deals with private sector companies to invest and scale in innovative clean energy projects in the United States across a range of sectors. And they reached what is known as a conditional commitment on an additional $46.6 billion. And that actually means those conditional commitments also count as obligated. There will be a quiz about what it means for money to be obligated, so I hope you are all taking. In addition, in addition to all of these billions and billions of dollars, which is more than the United States has ever invested in public money in clean energy at any point in our history, the lion's share of the IRA is actually flowing through the tax code, as many of you heard from my colleague Luke Bassett at a previous conversation. The IRA contained 24 new or substantially revised tax provisions to incentivize investment from the private sector, to lower costs for consumers, to buy electric vehicles or install clean energy in their homes. And we, with our colleagues at the Department of Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service, and with, I should say, incredible technical assistance from colleagues at the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, even the Department of Transportation at one point, issued 96 tax guidance documents covering all but one of those tax provisions. This is a land speed record for federal tax policy, I have to say. It is not uncommon for it to take decades for a single tax guidance document to be issued. And the reason that we pushed so hard and moved so quickly was that so that we could see activity like this. So all of that, all of us with our heads down in Washington, issuing funding opportunities, evaluating applications, signing contracts, issuing tax guidance. What is it for? It's for this. And so this is a map showing, trying to start answering the question of where did all of this go out into the country? This is a map from our friends at Atlas Public Policy. They run an amazing tracker. You can go to that website, cleaneconomytracker.org. They update it frequently, showing where investments in manufacturing of clean energy technologies have bubbled up since the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law just, again, 2.5 years ago. More than 1,000 facilities have announced investments enabled by the Inflation Reduction Act. 350,000 announced jobs. That is probably an underestimate of the number of jobs being supported from these investments. More than $270 billion coming off of the sidelines, going into the economy to support these projects and to build clean energy technologies in the United States. And notably, given the moment that we are in politically in Washington, 3/4 of those investments are located in districts represented by Republicans in the House of Representatives. And of course, you can fill in the blanks yourself for the senators based on the Senate map. That is just the activity in just clean energy manufacturing in the last 2.5 years. In power generation, you see a very similar picture. $215 billion estimated, probably an underestimate, in planned clean power generation, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. Record-breaking deployments in 2023 and in 2024 of new solar energy on the grid. That 2023 number was a 50% increase over 2022. It is entirely attributable to the incentives to the law in the Inflation Reduction Act. And thanks to all of this, for the first time ever last year in the United States, generation on the grid, electricity generation from wind and solar combined, surpassed the amount of electrons, the amount of electricity coming from coal-fired power plants. This is an absolute revolution in how we run our economy. And again, it was accomplished in just a blisteringly short period of time because we set the incentives and we let the private sector run with them. But what happens now? We did all of this. We lost the election. We didn't win the House. We didn't win the Senate. Republicans have unified control of Washington. And there is a lot of unprecedented action in just the last 3 weeks. So there are sort of 3 things to pay attention to as people who care about the clean energy economy, as people who care about developing and deploying clean energy in the United States, as people who care about the strength of the economy as a general matter and the strength, perhaps, of our democracy as well. There are 3 challenges facing the clean energy transition and the Inflation Reduction Act right now. One is crises that I describe here as administration-induced crises, and we can dive deeper into any and all of these. Since taking office, President Trump and his administration have engaged in repeated illegal and unconstitutional attempts to freeze the disbursement of those obligated grants and loans that are subject to those contracts between the federal government and the counterparty, and in so doing are calling into question the full faith and credit of the United States and calling into question whether any entity, not just an entity in clean energy, can trust that the federal government is going to do what they say they're going to do when you sign a contract with them. That is a crisis. They have frozen federal permitting for renewables, both on and offshore, with no sign of when those permits will be reinstated. And so insofar as you look at federal lands and federal waters as an opportunity for generating clean electricity, that is completely on hold at this moment in time, and it is unclear whether and when and how that might come back online, and so that imperils all of those many of those clean electricity investments that we just looked at on the map. All of that is creating ongoing legal uncertainty for actors in the private sector, for states, for cities, for nonprofit organizations, and they're suing over it. And judges are saying that it is illegal and unconstitutional, and the administration is ignoring them. And so, whether this affects something that you care about today, maybe not, but it probably will tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, the day after that. And so, it is an area of immense challenge for the clean energy transition. Congress is going to take up tax reform this year. They have been very explicit that one of the things that they are looking at is repealing those tax incentives that were passed in the Inflation Reduction Act that are underpinning all of those private sector investments on our manufacturing map, on our clean energy generation map. And so that too is creating a great deal of uncertainty in the market and is already starting to slow additional private investment as folks wait to see what happens to these long-term tax incentives that were passed just 2.5 years ago. And then, as we'll get into a little bit, I hope, there's unfinished business from the Inflation Reduction Act. It was a big, important law. It contained a lot of really good things. We got a lot done, but it didn't do nearly enough to build out transmission infrastructure. Did a little bit, didn't do nearly enough. Didn't do enough to reform how permitting works in the United States, how you get approval to build and site and establish energy infrastructure. Did a little bit, didn't do enough. And for really novel technologies, it became evident over the course of implementation that lowering the costs, providing incentives to create the technologies, to generate them, things like clean hydrogen, isn't enough in the absence of a market to buy the clean hydrogen. And so there's sort of a gap between supply and offtake that the Inflation Reduction Act did not cover, and that additional policy is needed to realize the full potential. But there are opportunities too, some of which remain to be seen pending the outcome of those challenges. But what I would say is that the long tail of opportunity is that economic growth in this country and in every country is deeply entwined with the energy system. It is an inescapable fact. And so in this time, particularly in the United States and in other developed countries, of load growth to deal with AI data centers, to deal with all of those manufacturing investments, to deal with electrification of homes and vehicles, the need to build more electricity generation and transmission is going to continue. The need for it to be clean, the imperative for it to be clean and zero emitting remains in place. And so I think you will continue to see innovation, you will continue to see activity, but it is going to be at greater cost and at greater uncertainty, and it's going to be slower than it otherwise would be. And that is a loss for all of us. I do think we will eventually see the grants and loans start flowing again in accordance with the law. But that might be more wishful thinking than the moment demands at this present time. I don't know. And then finally, of course, we can apply lessons learned from the Inflation Reduction Act to state policy and to global policy now, and hopefully to federal policy in the United States again in the future. So what are some of those lessons? What are some of those gaps? And I've alluded to this a little bit over the course of the conversation, but one is that lowering production costs, as the Inflation Reduction Act largely intended to do and largely succeeded in doing, is not always enough on its own, particularly for novel technologies where you are trying to put a clean alternative in place to substitute for a higher polluting version that is already on the market. We see this most notably in clean hydrogen, but in other areas as well. And so offtake support matters, and policymakers should build that into their thinking as they are designing incentives, that you can't just generate the supply and expect the market to materialize. It's not always going to be appropriately matched in that way. You need a bridge to get over to get from the current system to the future. Two, and similarly, is that diversifying your supply chains and building energy security isn't going to happen through market incentives alone. You need to have the ability to fill financing gaps in a flexible way. Otherwise, projects are not going to materialize. We see this in the United States, especially in extraction and processing of critical minerals for the battery supply chain. These are areas where the PRC has an absolutely dominant global market position. And because they have a dominant global market position, they have the ability essentially to set the price and undercut whatever incentives we have put in place to establish those facilities in the United States. In the absence of additional flexibility, things like contracts for differences with the federal government, again, offtake agreements, other kinds of financing support, those investments simply will not materialize, and you will not achieve the supply chain security goals that Congress had in mind when they set out the Inflation Reduction Act. One thing that we ran into and that has been a subject of some headlines, if you've wondered, why is it taking so long for EV charging to get built with federal money? Why is it taking so long for home energy rebates to materialize with federal money? One of the things that we uncovered through implementation is that public sector capacity at the subnational level can be a real constraint. And it's not a constraint that the executive branch of the federal government can usually address on its own, because Congress has given us very specific instructions on how to flow the money down through those subnational agencies. And so when your legislature says you have to provide the funding to this specific office in all 50 states, irrespective of whether that specific office in all 50 states is set up to receive the money, understands how to deploy the money, has the staff to do the task that has been set to them, we the executive branch have no ability to change that absent Congress changing their mind. And so that leads to a sense that the government is not capable of solving these problems, when in fact you have basically a policy design issue that is not recognizing public sector capacity constraints appropriately and providing enough flexibility for the funds to flow more quickly to communities. And then finally, and this goes to the previous point that I was making, and to the slowdown in investment that we're starting to see, is that certainty and consistency in policy are essential. Everything becomes more expensive and harder and slower when businesses do not know what is coming next. And so we are at a time where we made incredibly rapid progress in 2.5 years. And it remains to be seen how much of that progress will continue and will deliver ongoing benefits to the American people, to the clean energy transition, and ultimately to the global climate. So I threw a lot at you. I only expect you to know what obligations are, not what everything in the IRA is. But thank you again for having me, and really looking forward to this discussion. Can we leave the pretty map?
Sure.
Yeah.
It'll show up there. I think the microphone in the room will be fine, so just join me right here. That was quite a masterclass in just barely 30 minutes. And the way that our class grid here is, we'll be finished within 18 minutes. So buckle up and be ready. Oh, I have 2 questions for you. First, I hope you will expand upon the political economy of the design of the 2-part policy in the Biden administration that led to these massive investments that now a subsection of the Republican electorate does not want to let go of. Even if they refuse to support it, they don't want to give it up now that they have it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to extend my line of inquiry here to point out that you have signaled to the field that members of Congress do need to be educated on, well, what are the narrative stories under every dot in the map behind our heads? And just last week, 10 different trade associations mobilized their members and had meetings with representatives from all 50 states to discuss exactly that for both the obligations and the tax credits. What is your confidence that that tactic will secure the enduring popular support for the policy and its investments?
Well, my confidence is that in the absence of that education, the potential is zero. So the education is essential, because at the end of the day, talk is cheap. It's very easy to say we hate the Green New Scam. We want to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. It's not doing anything for the American people. It is a lot harder to say that when folks are in your office saying we've got 1,000 jobs in your district employing your constituents that are only there because these incentives are on the table. This is why we move this money. This is why we plan this facility. It's why we cut the ribbon. It's why we hired all those people. If we don't have that, those people are not going to have jobs anymore. And part of that education, beyond that basic political economy, needs to stretch as well to understanding how the parts of the law actually work together. So a lot of these dots are battery manufacturing facilities. The United States, when President Biden took office, had basically zero facilities, very, very few facilities. There was a gigafactory in Reno, and barely anything else for manufacturing electric vehicle batteries. We now have enough planned investments that by 2030, we could manufacture all of the batteries for all of the electric vehicles that will be being bought and sold in the United States in that year, if they all come to fruition, and if there's the demand to buy the batteries to put them in the electric vehicles. So Republicans in Congress really, really, really hate the EV tax credits. It's the one thing they can kind of agree on. They don't like that there's this incentive for consumers to buy electric vehicles, lower the sticker price of doing so because they're still more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. Those battery factories aren't going to sell to EV factories overseas. That's going to be too expensive. The batteries produced in the United States will be too expensive. They need to be sold to electric vehicles being produced in the United States. But if you're not producing electric vehicles in the United States, there's no reason to produce batteries in the United States either. And so the things work together, and that is clearly not well understood, and is part of what folks are working to educate on. But do I think every single thing in the Inflation Reduction Act is going to survive? Seems very unlikely. But the hope is there that on the tax credit side, at least, some of those incentives will remain in place simply because of the wild amount of economic activity that they are underpinning right now.
Thank you for giving us a more extended perspective on that, the political economy piece. Now I want to switch to a legal piece of current events. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't think you're a lawyer, but I do still want to elicit some comment. You see, there was a judge on Monday who found that the president was disregarding court orders to pause an executive action that would pause the release of funds that were already obligated under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So that's both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the judge already had previously found that that order needed to be paused pending further examination, but the people who had obligations came to get their money under those obligations and were refused, provided that evidence back to the court, found that essentially the president was in contempt of the court. This has led to some opinions that there's a constitutional crisis over the checks and balances between the three branches of the democratic governance design at the federal level. And you made some very strong remarks earlier that this is not a test of the Inflation Reduction Act alone. It's a test of the full faith and credit of the federal government when it signs contracts with any counterparty for any purpose. Can you lead into the current events of the judge's reiteration just yesterday that the president was disregarding clear and unambiguous direction to stand down?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think politically they're being canny in trying to test this approach on things that they judge as politically unpopular, like the Green New Scam, like foreign aid funding out of the U.S. Agency for International Development, like funding for housing migrants in New York City, because they think that they can score political points and try to gain legal precedents that will allow them essentially complete control over the power of the purse. But the very beginning, Article 1 of the United States Constitution gives that power to the Congress to appropriate funds and to direct the executive branch in how to deploy them. And in the absence of respect for that, we are in a constitutional crisis. And so, like I said, I think if you are not affected today, you will be tomorrow or the day after or the day after if you're doing business with the federal government under these circumstances. And that is really has incredible potential to damage the United States economy and the global economy.
That will really rivet the attention on the significance of that test of the executive authority that you are entrusted to steward. I want to turn to the folks that are live here in the room participating in the seminar because we just have about 9 minutes left. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time and allow Christina to respond to the ones that I think will propel our insight the farthest. Then we'll come back for another round 3. So who's ready? I see one in the back. I see Amanda down here and you in the aisle. Right in the back. What's your name?
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences over the past few years. My question is, from your perspective, over that period, do you think there's any appetite, either at the state or the federal level for policies which include a stake, such as a carbon fee and dividend, for example?
Yeah, so I said it's, we're doing multiple questions, sorry.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks so much for being here. So you mentioned at the beginning of the IRA is all carrots and no sticks. And in a way, thinking long term, not just like near politics and visibility and, assuming that Democrats get their stuff together eventually. To what extent is a carrots only policy effective? To what extent a gradual phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, tax credits is something that is required for a just clean energy transition? Because for me, having incentives on both sides has always been confusing. You're incentivizing both things in a way, especially given U.S. major oil production.
That's a great pair of questions to take together. What you got now?
Thank you for your talk. You alluded to the problem about capacity in a lot of subnational, state, local governments. And I'm curious, with the Trump administration, wanting to offload, for example, emergency management to the states, how you think these state governments can build capacity in the wake of such visions.
Great question. So I'll take the two together and speak to that. Almost all carrots, one stick in the IRA, which was actually the first ever federal fee on methane pollution. And so that is an EPA regulation. We got it finalized. I think they're going to try to repeal it through the Congress, but it can be done. It put a price on methane emissions, not a price on carbon. And for major oil and gas producers, I think with more than 25,000 metric tons of methane pollution per year, would have to start paying pretty steep fees on the methane that they were emitting from their oil and gas operations. We did elsewhere in the Biden administration enact air regulations, including on the oil and gas industry, particularly to tackle methane pollution. And in an interesting way, this is not a universal view in the oil and gas industry, so please do not take it as such. But many of the largest oil and gas producers in the United States, who are big multinational companies that work in multiple jurisdictions, really strongly support actually even regulation on their methane emissions, because they think it gives them a competitive advantage against the companies that aren't as good at controlling their methane pollution. And they also see, because they work in multiple jurisdictions, that regardless of what happens cycle to cycle in the United States, it's something that they have to get better at in order to remain globally competitive. I will note that every Democratic administration has wanted to get rid of the exploration tax breaks for oil and gas, but if Congress doesn't get rid of them, we can't just get rid of them on our own. So that was a policy proposal of the Biden administration, of the Obama administration, of the Clinton administration, and Congress is not taking it up, but I would like them to. On FEMA, it's not going to go great. It's not going to work. It's going to lead to enormous pain and suffering, or to enormous state and local tax increases. Because at the end of the day, if there is a disaster, it is the public sector that helps respond to it. And there is simply no way to devolve responsibility for responding to those kinds of events to individual states. There are times in the United States where we're 50 states, and there are times that we are one country. And it has always been the case that in response to disasters has been one of those times that we have pooled our resources and banded together because there's no other alternative. And so if they do, in fact, go forward with trying to devolve FEMA to the states, it is going to lead to enormous human suffering.
There's a wrinkle in that interpretation I'd like to add, which is that the Stafford Act, which is the name of the law that governs how disaster relief is paid for, is one of the few forms of allowance for appropriations from Congress under rules that are used in Congress that don't require the members of Congress to pay for whatever it is they're buying. So if you've ever heard people use the jargon pay-fors, if you're going to spend something, you need to find a way to pay for it. Stafford Act spending doesn't require you to find something to pay for it with. So it pretty much all goes on the national credit card. If the national credit card is suddenly unavailable and all of those obligations are sent to the states, many of which do have balanced budget amendments, then you need to find a way to pay for it in exactly the way that Christina has just described, just raising revenue within individual states where those disasters are occurring. So I just wanted to underscore the mechanics of how the federal governance system works and pays for things is intensely important to understand as you think about the ramifications of some of the changes to this architecture. We have enough time for us to take 2 more questions. I'll take 3, and then Christina can choose 3. Choose a couple. Who's got another round? Right here in the front. 1 second. Who's got the second? Way in the back. I see you. And who's got the third?
It's all clear as mud. You have no questions.
All right, I'm going to go with these 2 because we're down to the last 3 minutes.
You didn't speak about Europe and the fact that they're going to continue doing what they're doing, including a card and border adjustment tax. How do you think this administration is going to deal with the rest of the world's economy, which is transitioning, and whether that's going to have any influence at all, or whether they're going to try to be exceptional?
And way in the back.
Knowing what you know now about the Trump administration's response these last couple of weeks, is there anything you would have done differently in kind of that final sprint out the door in late December, early January?
I don't know that there's anything we could have done differently, to be honest with you. In particularly following the election, we designed IRA implementation, I should say, from the outset to basically get what I think of as the acute phase of federal implementation. So designing those programs, issuing those funding opportunities, making those award decisions, issuing that tax guidance to basically get it done in 2.5 years. And we largely did. We set a goal to obligate at least 80% of the funds at the outset of implementation. We obligated more than 80% of the funds. We would have liked to get nobody asked what the one tax credit is. It's for existing nuclear production. It's 45U. We put that way at the bottom of the priority list because actually as a policy matter, there's not a lot of daylight between a Democratic and a Republican administration. And so we judged that the risk of leaving that unfinished was not that considerable. And so we got all of that done. I think, if I would have, it would have been ideal, I think, if the Inflation Reduction Act had passed in December of 2021, when it very nearly did, instead of in August of 2022, because I think that additional even 8 months would have been a difference maker in communicating about the benefits and in having more of those grants actually being resulting in projects and rather than just in contracts and agreements with counterparties. your point is exactly right, and actually is generally where I would like to end, and is, I think, a cause for long tail opportunity optimism, with a little bit of a pessimistic gloss, which is that the rest of the world wants to do this. Our allies and partners spent the first sort of 3 months after we passed the IRA being really, really mad at us, and then the next 2 years trying to copy it. And they're not backing off of doing so, because we were able to prove out that an investment-led strategy can lead to decarbonization, can lead to supply chain resilience, can lead to greater deployment of renewables than anything else that we had tried to date. And so the European Union is certainly front and center. The United Kingdom, under the current government, is going really big. The Australians, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Indians, Kenya, Brazil, you are going to see all of these countries continuing to pursue this agenda. And the only question for us is whether the United States is going to continue to lead, or if we are going to be absolutely left in the dust. And that's not up to me anymore, unfortunately.
Friends, before we disperse, I want to acknowledge that if you were enrolled last quarter, you heard from Karen Skelton, who already gave you her vision and vantage point on working with Christina Costa, John Podesta, and the team in the White House on this project of implementation. Here you are again, winter quarter, hearing from Christina Costa's view. It's extraordinary for us to be able to receive these guests and give you a first-person perspective. Some of you will be in a small discussion group following this occasion, and I promise you that we'll continue to facilitate as much public engagement on campus with these public policies and the impacts that we know that they have for your lifetime and your livelihoods. For now, I'd like you to join me in warmly thanking Christina Costa for dedicating her time to the Energy Summit this afternoon.